videos, I'm going to guide you into pretty much everything you need to know to understand Crimea, why Crimea is important, how different parties think about Crimea, and well, let's start here. Okay, so here is the Black Sea. Let me zone out a little bit. So Europe is here, Russia is here, Turkey is here. Here's the Black Sea. And Crimea is this little bit of land that juts into the Black Sea. Okay, so right now, Russia has annexed it as of 2014 and claims it for Russia. Ukraine claims it for Ukraine and says that Russia illegally annexed it. So let's go on and talk about Crimea over time. If we look at history, Crimea, now, one of the reasons that this is important to go and look at it over time is because Russia claims, like, this has always been our land. Okay, so the Crimean Peninsula begins about the 5th century with Greek colonies. So if anybody had the original claim to it, it would be the Greeks. After that, it was the Byzantine Empire. So if you look at the map here, you'll see the Byzantine Empire, and they had this little slice on it on Crimea, the Byzantines. So the Byzantines had the next claim to it. Then we had the Mongol conquest. Now the Mongols pretty much run roughshod over everything from Mongolia, Russia, all the way into parts of Europe, and they ran over it for some time and had it. So after the Golden Horde, after they collapsed, then the Ottomans. The Ottomans are the Turks. So Turkey then had a next claim to it. And then in 1774, the Ottoman Empire is defeated by Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great is the one who talked about Novorossiya. Novorossiya means New Russia, and it's largely the area that's essentially the size of Ukraine. And this was something that she brought into the Russian Empire. From then, the Russians kind of held it, but kind of held it and then didn't hold it and then held it and then didn't. We'll talk about that in just a second. So there's the Russian Civil War. Crimea changed hands many times during that time. Let's look at that. During the Russian Revolution and Civil War, before the Soviet Union, it was held by the Crimean People's Republic, or it was the Crimean People's Republic, then the Taruda Soviet Socialist Republic, then Ukrainian People's Republic, then Crimean Regional, and then Crimean Regional Government, and then Crimean Socialist Soviet Republic, South Russian Government, Russian Government of South Russia, Revolutionary Committee, and Crimea. So it changes hands a whole bunch. Then in the Soviet Union in 1921, you had a really strange mix of things that happened. And in Ukraine, it was 1991 forward, it was Ukraine. Okay, so before 1991, and this is important, this is really, really hyper important to understand. During Soviet times, the world looked very different, right? So pretty much all of this region from Russia, uh, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, all this Bulgaria, and down here we're into Georgia and some of these other little states, Kazakhstan over here. All this territory was all part of the Soviet Union, and so because that is how it was. It didn't really matter when in 1956, 19 something like that. Oh, by the way, before this, the Russians occupied it or held the land, and then it was taken by the Nazis briefly, and then it was transferred back to the Russians. Okay, so it was occupied by Germany for a little while, came back to the Soviet Union after World War II, and so it becomes as an oblast. An oblast is essentially a province, a territory. What we call in the United States a state is essentially like a province, okay? Which was then transferred to the Ukrainian SSR on the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Pekarov. Okay, so this is this 300th anniversary. Let's do some math. 1654. It's 1954 when it's transferred to Ukraine. Why is it transferred? Because Soviet Premier Khrushchev transferred it, and it didn't really matter because if the Soviets held all this territory, it didn't matter if this was part of Russia or if this was part of Ukraine. So it didn't matter. It's part of the whole. But when the Soviet Union collapses and Russia's its own country and Ukraine's its own country and Belarus is its own country and Lithuania is and Poland, right? You get it? So now, wait a minute, whose was this? Well, Russia likes to say that it's theirs, and the Ukrainians had held it since 1956. Okay, let's move forward. Now, here's another really interesting article in NPR, how Russia's current war in Ukraine echoes its Crimean War of the 1850s. And so this is going to give you a lot of background about how to think about what was going on then and how it's impacting us even today. So the article says that Russia had a more powerful army and expected a quick victory. Sounds kind of eerily familiar. This is what they expected. They outnumber Ukrainians 3-1, and they expected to just go over there and take all their stuff like a fifth grader rolling into a kindergarten's kickball game, right? They were just going to roll in, and it didn't work out so well. It didn't think that Western powers would intervene, yet the French and the English both intervened. Now, this war gave us some fascinating figures like Florence Nightingale. She made her name in the Crimean War. We also know of Leo Tolstoy, and his experience in the Crimean War shaped him. He's the author of Crime and Punishment and War and Peace and the famous, epic Russian novel. Okay, so what actually happened with the Crimean War? So the immediate cause of the war was involving the rights of Christian minorities in Palestine. Now that was then part of the Ottoman Empire, and so it was under kind of Islamic control. But the Russia was promoting the cause of those that were Eastern Orthodox Christians, and they historically had Greek and Russian were the power bases for Orthodox Christianity. Now, the churches worked out their differences, but then Nicholas, that's the Tsar Nicholas, issued an ultimatum that demanded the Orthodox subjects of the Ottoman Empire be placed under his protection. Sounds familiar? That's exactly essentially what Putin was saying now about how, hey, we have these Russians or Russian speakers in Donbass that need to be protected by Russia. And so it's the same kind of thing. It's the same song, next verse. Okay, back to where we were with this NPR article. The Economist magazine, the same one that's still going strong, wrote a scathing piece in 1854 on Russia and its leader, Tsar Nicholas I. He said this: that vast state is in great measure composed of spoils which he has torn from surrounding nations. Her frontier provinces are filled with injured, disconnected, hostile populations. So Russia has been, for centuries, expansionist. Like, if you look at the globe again, look at the size of Russia. Like, this is Russia. It goes all the way over to here and all the way over to the Pacific. It's huge. And they were fighting with Sweden and Finland. They were fighting with Poland. They were fighting with Ukraine. So again, it's huge. And their territory, well, they just kind of have taken it wherever they have been. They've been very imperialist, which is ironic because they love to talk about, Putin particularly, loves to talk about how the United States is this imperialist country that's, right? Well, that's their history too. Okay? This is a war backed by the Orthodox Church. He's an autocrat. He sees himself as a bulwark against liberal principles from the West. Now, that was talking about Nicholas, but I mean, you might as well say the same thing about Putin because that's what Putin is claiming as well. Russia had a huge army in 18. Oh, by the way, when I say the Orthodox Church, I don't mean people who subscribe to, the Bible as that. I'm talking about the specific Russian Orthodox sect of Christianity, that specific slice. Okay, back to the show. Russia had a huge army in the 1850s, but they planned poorly for the Crimean War. Sounds familiar again. Huge army, bad planning. Very quickly after the outbreak of the war, it turned out that Russia was so weak that it couldn't even properly supply the troops within its own territory. Same kind of issues, logistical. Nicholas I also thought that Western powers would not interfere with his war against Ottoman Empire, which he called the sick man of Europe. That was their nickname by historians, the sick man of Europe. He was stunned when Britain and France joined the fight with the Ottomans against Russia. Now, same kind of thing happened with what's going on today. In 2022, Putin looked around and thought, you know what? The US isn't going to intervene. Look what happened in Afghanistan when people were falling off the planes. Europe's not going to intervene. They need our gas and our oil. So, same kind of thing. He was stunned when the West intervened. He essentially, he here is Nicholas, but it works for Putin as well. He essentially blundered his way into this war. That's kind of what happened here. Okay, this is a scene from the battlefield. These are cannonballs on here, unexploded cannonballs after the charge of the Light Brigade. Well, what's the Light Brigade? Do you remember that? That's from the Crimean War. So we'll get to that in just a moment. Putin did not believe that Europeans and the United States would push back against what Russia was doing. He also didn't believe that Europe and the United States would agree on these tough sanctions. And so Putin has miscalculated and then miscalculated and then miscalculated again. Okay, so this is the Battle of the Light Brigade. So what's the Light Brigade? The Charge of the Light Brigade. Britain's Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote an epic poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. And when I start reading it, you're going to find that some of it's familiar. Forward, the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew. Someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply. Theirs not to reason why. Theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Okay, last charge of the Light Brigade. So we have some famous people like Lord Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson. We have Tolstoy with War and Peace. We have Florence Nightingale that come out of this war. Now, the aftermath of this is even more fascinating than anything that I talked about so far. So Russia loses the Crimea War. They have to have humiliating terms. Now, one of the things that was really interesting, and it's not here, it's in a documentary I watched about it, was the Tsar said, you know, consolingly, well, Crimea is not Russia. Okay, now Putin is saying Crimea is Russia. So when he lost this and had to take these humiliating terms about what fought here, well, okay, at least they didn't get into St. Petersburg, is what he was saying, which was the capital at the time, because naval vessels were attacking St. Petersburg. Well, Crimea is not Russia. Okay, Russia pledged not to place warships in the Black Sea. Well, that's where they are now. Today, Russia is projecting naval power in the Black Sea, and Putin recently compared himself to Peter the Great. This was about a month ago, where he talked about how Peter the Great had returned territory to Russia, and maybe it's left to us to be like Peter the Great. I mean, that's kind of eerie. And of course, Putin's an imperialist, and he blames the West for being imperialist, but that's what he is. Okay, Russia today acts as an empire. They're trying to take land that they perceive to have belonged to them in the past. That's true, but who else did it belong to? The Greeks, the Byzantines, the Mongols, Ottomans, the Russians, and probably, depending on how far, maybe not Crimea, but much of Ukraine was also taken by the Poles and other invaders as well. So, like, you can't just say, well, we owned it once in the past, because that doesn't really fly. Now, because Russia was part of the winning side in World War II, and only because of this, they had a sweetheart kind of deal with what was going on in Europe. I mean, they grabbed really a lot of territory after World War II, because who was the bad guy? Germany was the bad guy. And so they essentially grabbed up all of Eastern Europe. Okay, and that included Ukraine and Crimea, which they already held Ukraine and Crimea as part of the Soviet sphere, but they grabbed up a bunch of this land. Okay, Russia was part of the winning side in World War II, and I'm going somewhere with this. So we think about Russia as like, Russia, they have been so tough. And then we think about Russia as being tough because after World War II, we were into the Cold War, where it was America and Russia, and they were kind of like at loggerheads, and like, not Russia, America and the Soviet Union, and we're like, okay, these are the superpowers. And then the Soviet Union fell apart. And Russia is only a small fraction, let's say a fifth, 2/5 of what Soviet Union was. And so it's not really the superpower that we're thinking it was, but in Putin's mind it is. Now, but let's look at the rest of their military history. It was defeated by Japan in the 1904-1905 war and had a terrible showing in World War I. That's what led to the Russian Revolution. And the Soviet Union lost to Afghanistan, to rebels fighting in Afghanistan over 10 years. By the way, let me just add this. They lost more soldiers in Ukraine in the last 4 months than they did in 10 years in Afghanistan. More soldiers killed in action in 4 months in Ukraine than 10 years in Afghanistan. Okay, so they lost in Afghanistan too. Russia has really built this myth of being a global superpower, but what we've seen since the invasion of Ukraine is that they're not a superpower. And I think there's something very right about this. Now let me move along And just point out, here's Florence Nightingale. She was famous as a nurse in Crimea. Here's Tolstoy. He was famous as a novelist, and his experiences, like Sevastopol sketches, were based on his experience in the Crimean War. Then we also have William Sword. Now, I haven't talked about William Sword yet, but William Sword should be in your mind if you're a student of American history, because William Sword, who was the Secretary of State when he purchased Alaska. The purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867 was known as Seward's Folly, or sometimes Seward's Icebox. But you know what? This man right here, this grumpy looking guy, he may have very well changed the destiny of the world in the 20th century. Why? Let me show you on the map. Russia, this is Alaska, right? If we look at the map and we spin out, we think about Alaska in terms of like, here's the United States, and Alaska is up here. But let's zoom out a little bit and see what's actually going on. There's Alaska, and this is Russia. Russia owned all this real estate all the way over. Once upon a time, it owned all the way to Alaska, but they had sold Alaska in 1867, so the dividing line is right here. So, now let me also show you what the dividing line looks like. Let's zoom in a little bit. There's about 45 miles between the tip of Russia and the tip of Alaska, but it's even more than that because there's these two little islands. There's a larger island and a smaller island right here. And Russia owns the larger island, the United States owns a smaller island, and they're about 2.5 miles from each other. That's how far US is from Russia. Now think about that. Now that's interesting. Now, as I say that, that's just a little factoid, but when you really think about like how would it have changed things if the Soviets could have placed nuclear weapons right here, this close to the continental US? Or they could have put an invasion force anywhere in here, this close to the US during the Cold War. It would have been a game changer. And so, what William Sword did when this man right here bought Alaska from Russia in 1867, he changed the game. And he changed the game because the result of the Crimean War was that Russia was broke. Russia had to pay back its bills, and that's why they sold Alaska. So if you're wondering about why is this little place called Crimea so important, it's contested real estate. Putin says it belongs to Russia. Zelensky says it belongs to Ukraine. And that's what we're really fighting over, is real estate that goes way, way back. And that's what you need to know about Crimea. Hey, thanks for your time. If you enjoyed this, I do daily updates about the war in Ukraine. Please subscribe. And I hope that helps you understand what you need to understand about Crimea.